All right, welcome to the after show.
All right, T. So you already know I got a question.
What?
So how was that to have a podcast episode with your therapist? What was that like?
You know what? I think it was cool. I don't know. This is my assumption. I wonder if and maybe you can let me know as a therapist how this would be for you. I made it known in the episode because I wanted to let folks know, like, hey, this
Mhm.
is something that's, a sensitive topic for me and something I'm working through. And so I think that because of your confidentiality policy and what comes into play at being a therapist, I think that Eve Marie was very like particular not to respond to everything that I was saying and provide additional context. It was like she wanted to be very professional and also
Yes.
respect my confidentiality. So I sensed that. I think I was okay though. I One thing that was interesting is because when we chat, we just have very great like in-depth conversations. It just felt like I didn't have a chance to be as detailed as I wanted to be
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, it doesn't it just it's hard to do because yeah,
Yeah, because you're used to having like a therapy session where it is
exactly,
just
exactly,
you and you can go in about your specific stuff. And
exactly.
here we are. One, you have a visible third person in the room.
Yes.
And then we have this invisible wall of people in the room,
Yes.
i.e., our audience, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so I could totally see where that would put a shift
yeah.
in the dynamic.
What I will say, because we also have some technical issues, and so that's a
Yeah.
little tough when you're trying to communicate and you have technical issues. But my hope is that when we're in post production and the editing is done, my hope is that the listeners that do tune in, they can still get the gems because she definitely
Yes,
dropped a lot of gems, and I hope that
definitely.
we're able to get it to just flow seamlessly. Where folks listen and they're like, "Oh, this was a good episode." Because sometimes in the moment, I feel like we've had episodes where we're like, "The audio was so bad. Like, what's going on?" But then
Yes,
you listen and you're like, "Oh, but the content is still good." So I hope that
exactly.
we can still get that feeling after. I was gonna ask you a question, Dom. I think I forgot. Um, what about for you? Like, what would come up for you if you were like, let's say one of your clients was like, "Hey, Dr. Dom, I want to have you on my podcast." How would you feel like preparing for something like that?
We would have a conversation ahead of time of what they are wanting me to talk about. And then also I would let them know that they take the lead on what they disclose and that
Hmm.
they are the ones just exactly like what happened with you and Eve Marie. Like as the client, you are the person who reveals
Yeah.
that you are my client.
Hmm.
I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And so, but once you do it, you open the door. But
Exactly.
of course, kind of like exactly like how Eve Marie did, like she answered your questions, but she never, on her part, she never shared any of your personal things, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And I would respond in the same way.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, obviously that's why many of us go to therapy, one for the healing, but also for the aspect of confidentiality that you get. And I
Hmm.
also remember during one of our first sessions, I think all of my therapists over the years have said this, but like if we see you out in public, I don't know you. You can say hi to me, but like
Yep. Yep.
I'm not waving. That must be hard to do because I'm just I feel like sometimes I wouldn't say that I'm impulsive, but if I know someone, I have like a
You want to
physical
speak.
reaction. Yeah, and like I feel
Yeah.
like your body, like you just kind of react like, oh, that's so and so. But as a therapist, you must have to really like keep it
Yeah.
together. Like, okay, there's that person. Let me just act like
Yeah,
there's
I mean,
nothing
and it
wrong.
depends on the setting and the clients
Yeah,
too, right? Working
yeah,
at a university, I tell my students the same thing, right? My student
yeah,
clients that you see me walking down the walkway, you speak to me first,
yeah.
and then I'll acknowledge you, you know?
Exactly.
And I have to say, I cannot recall any student that I worked with who
Hmm.
didn't speak.
Oh,
So, and I even had some students that, they're walking with friends or other folks and they tell them who I am. you
Oh,
know?
cool. Yeah, that's dope.
And so to me, that is dope. Like, that's like breaking that stigma, right? Of
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh, that's Dr. Broussard, that's my therapist, you know?
Right, right.
And so, but for me, it really is about protecting confidentiality. And that's, I mean,
Mhm.
and I recognize too that like being on campus is different than if we were out in the streets, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yep.
if I'm walking in downtown Oakland or downtown San Francisco
Mhm.
and I see a client, that's a totally different experience.
Yeah,
And if they didn't speak to me in that space, I still I would understand.
yeah. You know what? That makes perfect sense. I'm glad that you brought that example up because it made me think about how therapy these days, it's definitely, although there's still a stigma, I mean, it's nowhere as near as how it used to be. Like,
Right.
you see so many public figures, especially Black people and people of color, talking
Yes,
about
I
therapy,
love it.
which is so great, right?
Yes.
However, I will say, I didn't even think twice about like, oh, talking about my therapy experience. We've talked about it on the podcast and even having my therapist actually come on the show. That I didn't think twice about that. However, if it were something like a sex therapist that I had, I think that that still has a stigma to
Yeah.
it. Like if there's a therapist that specializes
Yep.
is being a sex therapist, whether it's having them on the podcast or if we were out in the street and I was with friends, I probably would not be as comfortable saying like, "Oh, hey y'all, there go my therapist," because there's still a stigma with that. Let's be honest,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, that's real.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think that that will change it up a little bit, but I think we're making progress, slow and steady
Yes, we
progress.
are. Yes,
And
we are.
I'm looking forward to seeing how this episode is going to be. So my fingers are crossed that all the editing will
And
work
it
well. And lady,
yes.
hopefully you enjoyed this episode as well.
Yes, there's lots of good gems.